In a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, a little girl sat on a crumbling step, her eyes fixed on the shifting shadows cast by passing cars. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying the distant hum of life she had never been a part of. Her name was Lila, and her world had always been a silent echo of longing and neglect. Inside the dimly lit apartment she called home, chaos reigned. Empty bottles rolled across the floor like discarded promises, and the stale air clung to the walls with the weight of despair. Lila's parents, Rachel and Martin, were ghosts of their former selves, lost to their vices and indifferent to the tiny souls that clung to hope in the shadows. Lila's existence was a lesson in survival. At just 6 years old, she had learned to read the subtle signs of her parents' moods, anger, and indifference. She learned to navigate hunger and silence, to shrink into the background where she was least likely to be noticed. But deep inside, she held on to a fragile wish for something better, even as her world taught her wishes were dangerous. One rainy evening, as Lila huddled near the cracked window, her parents made a decision that would change her life forever. It wasn't a choice born of love or regret but desperation. With little warning, they bundled her into the car and drove into the storm. The journey was silent, save for the patter of rain and the occasional engine growl, and Lila dared to hope, just a little, that maybe they were taking her somewhere safe this time. She was wrong. What happened next would test the limits of her courage and faith in humanity. It would expose the darkness of abandonment and the unexpected light of a second chance. Lila's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and the extraordinary power of kindness. But to understand where her journey leads, we must first see where it begins. If this glimpse into Lila's life has moved you, stay with us as we unravel her tale of survival and transformation. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit and the hope that can bloom even in the darkest corners. The rain fell in relentless sheets as the car sped through the narrow streets. Lila sat in the back seat, her small hands clutching the edge of her tattered coat, her wide eyes darting between her parents. Rachel, her mother, sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windshield. Beside her, Martin gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw clenched and his eyes hollow. Lila didn't dare ask where they were going. She had learned long ago that questions were met with sharp words or, worse, silence so cold it froze her voice before it could escape. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, heavier than the storm outside, and it pressed against her chest like an unseen hand. The city lights grew sparse as the car entered darker, quieter roads. The familiar landmarks of her small, chaotic world faded, replaced by rows of trees swaying in the wind. Lila pressed her face against the cold window, watching the rain blur the globe into an unrecognizable smear of shadows and light. The excitement that had flickered briefly inside her, hope that this trip might be something special, something good, dimmed with each passing mile. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drum against the roof. Rachel didn't respond. She lit another cigarette, the flicker of the lighter casting eerie shadows across her face. Martin didn't even glance back. Instead, his voice came low and strained. "Quiet, Lila. Just sit still." Lila bit her lip, shrinking further into the seat. She hugged her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The car's engine growled as it turned onto a lonely road, the trees now towering on either side like silent sentinels. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the only sounds were the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the occasional groan of the tires against the wet pavement. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowed and came to a stop. The sudden stillness was deafening. Martin turned off the engine, leaving only the sound of the rain to fill the void. Lila looked up, her heart pounding. She wanted to ask again, to beg for answers, but the words caught in her throat. Rachel turned in her seat, her expression unreadable. "Get out," she said, her voice flat. Lila blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. What?" Rachel's eyes narrowed. "I said get out, Lila. Now." The sharpness of her tone sent a chill down Lila's spine. She fumbled with the door handle, her small hands trembling. The cold air hit her like a slap as she stepped out into the rain, the mud squelching beneath her worn shoes. She turned back, her wide eyes pleading. "Mom? Dad? Where are we going?" Rachel didn't answer. She simply looked away, her jaw tight. Martin restarted the car, the engine roaring back to life. Without a word, he shifted into gear, and the vehicle began to move. "Wait," Lila cried, her voice breaking. She stumbled after them, her arms outstretched. "Don't leave me, please." But the car didn't stop. The red glow of the taillights disappeared into the night, leaving Lila standing alone on the muddy road. The rain poured harder, soaking her to the bone as her cries echoed into the emptiness. For a long time, she didn't move. The cold seeped into her, numbing her fingers and toes. She hugged herself tightly, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by dark woods that whispered with the wind. The only sign of life was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant croak of a frog. She wanted to scream, to cry out for someone, anyone, but the vastness of the night swallowed her voice before it could carry. Time lost meaning as Lila huddled by the side of the road. Her knees pulled to her chest. Her petite frame shook with cold and fear, the rain continuing its relentless assault. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there when a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Her heart leaped. For a brief, wild moment, she thought her parents had come back. She stumbled to her feet, waving her arms weakly. "Mom, Dad," she called, her voice hoarse. The car slowed as it approached, its bright lights illuminating her frail figure. It wasn't her parents. This was a larger vehicle, its paint shiny and dark even under the rain. The engine rumbled softly as it stopped a few feet away. The passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a warm voice that carried over the rain. "Oh my God," she said, her hands flying to her mouth. "Tom, there's a child here." The driver, a tall man with a steady presence, joined her. "What's she doing out here alone?" he murmured, his voice low with concern. The woman, Margaret, crouched in front of Lila, her movements slow and gentle. "Sweetheart, are you okay? What happened? Where are your parents?" Lila couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, and she looked away, unsure if she could trust them. Her parents' warnings echoed in her mind. "Don't trust anyone. People will only hurt you." But Margaret's voice was soft, her concern genuine. She reached out a hand, her palm open and inviting. "It's okay. We're here to help. Can you come with us? We'll take you somewhere warm." Lila hesitated, her instincts warring with her exhaustion. She was cold, hungry, and terrified. Slowly, she reached out and took Margaret's hand. The warmth of it startled her, almost painful against her frozen skin. Margaret wrapped Lila in her coat and guided her to the car. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming, and Lila felt a flicker of safety for the first time in hours. She curled up in the back seat, her body heavy with exhaustion. "We'll take her to the police station," Tom said, his voice firm but kind. As the car began to move, Lila pressed her face against the window, watching the dark woods blur into streaks of black and gray. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in her young life, she dared to believe it might be better than what she had left behind. The ride to the police station was quiet except for the engine's hum and the occasional murmur between Margaret and Tom. Lila sat in the back seat, her small frame wrapped tightly in Margaret's coat. She stared out the window, her fingers tracing the fogged-up glass as the city lights reappeared on the horizon. When they arrived, the police station felt overwhelming. Bright lights, unfamiliar faces, and an endless swirl of voices. Lila clung to Margaret's hand as they walked inside. An officer with a warm, steady demeanor approached, kneeling to meet Lila's eyes. "Hi there, sweetheart. My name's Officer Mason. You're safe now, okay?" he said gently, his voice calm and soothing. Lila didn't respond, her wide eyes darting around the room. Mason exchanged a look with Margaret, who nodded, her hand never leaving Lila's shoulder. "She hasn't said much," Margaret explained quietly. "We found her on the side of the road. Alone." Mason sighed, his face heavy with concern. Let's get her something warm to drink and figure this out. They led Lila to a small room with a worn couch and a table. A female officer brought her a cup of hot cocoa, the steam curling upward in soft tendrils. Lila wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She sipped it cautiously, her eyes never leaving the adults. "Do you know where your parents are?" Mason asked gently, sitting across from her. Lila shook her head, her grip tightening on the mug. She couldn't find the words to explain or make sense of the whirlwind that had brought her here. All she knew was the aching emptiness in her chest and the fear that lingered like a shadow. After some time, Mason sighed again. "We'll contact Child Services. There's a shelter nearby where she can stay for now." Margaret and Tom hesitated, exchanging a glance. Margaret crouched beside Lila, her eyes searching the girl's face. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "They'll take care of you." Though the words were meant to comfort, Lila felt lost. Even though she had only known Margaret and Tom for a few hours, their presence had been a rare moment of warmth in her cold, lonely world. As the social worker arrived to take her to the shelter, Lila clung to Margaret's hand one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she gave Lila a small, encouraging smile. "You're stronger than you know, Lila. Don't ever forget that." The shelter was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street. Its brick walls were weathered, but the soft glow of lights from its windows gave it an inviting warmth. Lila followed the social worker, her steps hesitant as they entered the building. The scent of clean air and faint cooking greeted her, a sharp contrast to the smoky, stale apartment she had called home. Inside, a kind woman with silver-streaked hair and a gentle smile met them. "Hello, Lila," she said warmly, crouching to meet the girl's gaze. "My name is Mrs. Ramirez, and I'll be looking after you here." Lila didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Ramirez didn't seem to mind. She reached out a hand, her touch light but steady, and guided Lila down a hallway lined with soft, warm lights. The room they entered was small but cozy. A single bed with a neatly folded quilt sat against one wall, and a nightstand held a small lamp that cast a soft glow. A window overlooked a courtyard where a few trees swayed gently in the night breeze. "This will be your space," Mrs. Ramirez said, her voice soothing. "You can rest here tonight. We'll talk more in the morning." Lila nodded faintly, her gaze sweeping over the room. She wasn't sure how to feel. The bed looked too soft, and the room was too clean. It didn't feel real. Mrs. Ramirez smiled reassuringly and stepped back, leaving her alone to adjust. As Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her small hands gripping the quilt, she felt the weight of the day crash over her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying felt dangerous, even here. Instead, she curled up on the bed, clutching the pillow as if it might anchor her to this strange, unfamiliar world. The night was restless. Dreams of the dark road and her parents' retreating car haunted her, pulling her from sleep with a gasp. The faint light under the door reassured her she wasn't alone, but the fear lingered like a shadow at the edges of her mind. Morning came with the soft sounds of footsteps and the clink of dishes from the kitchen. Lila sat up slowly, her body stiff from the night's tension. A gentle knock on the door startled her, and Mrs. Ramirez peeked in, her smile warm but unobtrusive. "Good morning, Lila. Breakfast is ready whenever you're ready to join us." Lila hesitated but nodded. She didn't trust this place yet, didn't trust that it wouldn't all disappear. But Mrs. Ramirez's patience made it easier to take the first step. In the dining room, children sat around tables, their quiet chatter filling the space. Lila hovered near the doorway, unsure of where to go, until Mrs. Ramirez appeared beside her with a plate of warm oatmeal and fresh bread. "Here you go," she said gently, setting the plate on an empty seat near the window. Lila sat down, her movements hesitant. She picked up the spoon, her hands trembling slightly as she tasted the food. It was warm, comforting, and unfamiliar. Lila felt a tiny flicker of safety for the first time in a long while. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her stay, to take another bite, and to begin imagining the possibility of something better. Days turned into weeks at the shelter, and though Lila remained cautious, The rhythm of her new life began to settle around her like a fragile cocoon. The quiet hum of the mornings, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen, and the gentle warmth of Mrs. Ramirez's smile created an environment similar to the chaos she had known. Yet, trust was a foreign concept to Lila. She was a fragile bird and wasn't ready to let perch on her shoulder. Lila's days were filled with structure, meals with other children, quiet time in the standard room, and the occasional activity like drawing or reading. But she kept her distance, often retreating to a corner where she could watch from the sidelines. The other children tried to include her, their curiosity unguarded, but Lila's responses were limited to small nods or glances. One afternoon, she heard a soft voice behind her while sitting by the large window in the standard room. "Hi, do you like to draw?" Lila turned to see a girl about her age holding a set of colored pencils and a stack of paper. Her name was Emma, and she had been at the shelter for several months. Emma's presence was calm, her movements unhurried as she settled beside Lila without waiting for an invitation. Lila hesitated, unsure how to respond, but Emma didn't mind. She slid a piece of paper toward Lila and placed a few pencils beside it. "You can use these," she said with a small smile. Then, she began drawing on her sheet, her pencil gliding across the paper in fluid strokes. For a long while, Lila sat still, the pencils untouched. But as she watched Emma create a scene of trees and flowers, something stirred within her. Tentatively, she picked up a pencil and began to draw. Her lines were initially hesitant, the shapes awkward, but Emma didn't comment. She simply smiled and continued her work. By the end of the afternoon, Lila had drawn a small house surrounded by stick figure people. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a fragile step toward connection for her. That evening, Mrs. Ramirez found her in the hallway and knelt beside her. "I heard you spent some time drawing today," she said, her voice warm. "That's wonderful, Lila. I'm proud of you." Lila blinked, and used to such words. They felt strange but good, like a warmth she hadn't realized she craved. Several weeks later, Mrs. Ramirez approached Lila during breakfast. She sat down beside her, folding her hands gently. "Lila," she began, her tone kind but purposeful, "a couple here would like to meet you. They're friends of the shelter, and they've been looking for someone special to join their family." Lila froze, her spoon hovering over her oatmeal. The word family felt heavy, foreign, almost impossible. Her parents' betrayal had taught her that family was a dangerous word, one that came with pain and broken promises. Mrs. Ramirez seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said gently. "Just meet them. Talk to them. See how you feel." Lila nodded reluctantly, her stomach twisting with nerves. Later that morning, she was led to a small room off the main hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, she saw a man and a woman sitting side by side. The woman, Nina, had dark hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap. Vincent was tall and broad, with kind eyes that carried a trace of sorrow. When Lila stepped inside, both stood, their movements slow and deliberate, as if not to startle her. Nina offered a soft smile. "Hello, Lila," she said, her voice gentle. "It's so nice to meet you. My name is Nina, and this is Vincent." Vincent nodded, his gaze warm but unobtrusive. "We've heard so much about you," he added. "We're happy to meet you finally." Lila stood awkwardly by the door, her fingers gripping the hem of her shirt. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. Calm, kind, and steady people like them were a mystery to her. Sensing her hesitation, Nina reached into a small bag and pulled out a book. "We brought this for you," she said, holding it out. "It's one of my favorites. It's about the stars and how they light up the night." Lila's eyes flicked to the book. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, but it was beautiful. Slowly, she stepped forward and took it, her fingers brushing against the faded cover. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nina's smile deepened. "You're welcome, sweetheart." They didn't ask her questions she couldn't answer. Instead, they talked about small things. The flowers they had seen on the way to the shelter, the weather, and a funny story about a bird that had landed on their car. Lila listened, her guard slowly lowering. Before they left, Vincent suggested a walk in the shelter's small garden. Lila hesitated but agreed, her curiosity outweighing her fear. As they strolled along the stone path, Nina pointed out different flowers, her voice soft and calming. Vincent stayed close but gave her space, his presence steady and reassuring. Near the end of the walk, Nina stopped and knelt beside her. "Lila," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Vincent and we've been looking for someone to share our lives with. We've both lost someone we loved very much, and now, we're hoping to find someone who can be a part of our family." Lila's chest tightened at the word family. She didn't trust it, not yet. But there was something in Nina's voice, in the way Vincent stood quietly beside her, that felt different. They weren't pushing her. They were waiting, letting her decide. For the first time in a long while, Lila nodded. "Okay," she said softly, the word carrying a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to feel before. A week later, Lila stood on the threshold of Nina and Vincent's home, her small suitcase clutched tightly in her hands. The house was nothing like the cramped, smoky apartment she had left behind. It was warm and inviting, with soft yellow paint on the walls and a garden filled with colorful flowers. The sight overwhelmed her, and she hesitated, her feet glued to the porch as if stepping inside would break the fragile spell. Nina noticed her hesitation and knelt beside her. "Take your time, Lila," she said gently. "This is your home now, but you don't have to rush. We'll be right here with you." Vincent placed a reassuring hand on Lila's shoulder. "We're not going anywhere," he added, his voice steady. With a slight nod, Lila took a tentative step forward. The door revealed a cozy living room with a soft couch, bookshelves lined with stories waiting to be read, and the faint aroma of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. It didn't feel real. It felt too good to be true. Nina led her upstairs to a small bedroom. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and a bed with a fluffy quilt sat by the window, its pillows perfectly arranged. A shelf already held a few books, including the one Nina had given her at the shelter. On the nightstand was a small lamp shaped like a star. "This is your room," Nina said with a smile. "You can decorate it however you like. We want it to feel like yours." Lila set her suitcase on the bed, her fingers brushing over the quilt. The word yours felt heavy and unfamiliar, but it planted a tiny seed of hope. She turned to Nina and Vincent, her voice small but steady. "Thank you." For the first few days, Lila kept to herself, her movements cautious as she adjusted to her new surroundings. Nina and Vincent were patient, giving her space while ensuring she never felt alone. They invited her to join them for meals, to help in the garden, or to read by the fireplace in the evenings. Slowly, Lila began to let her guard down. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Nina asked, "How was your day, Lila?" Lila paused, her fork hovering over her plate. She had spent the afternoon drawing in the garden, the sunlight warming her skin. "It was good," she said softly. Nina smiled, her eyes lighting up. "I'm glad to hear that." Vincent passed her the bread basket, his quiet presence reassuring. "We're proud of you, kiddo," he said. The words settled over Lila like a warm blanket, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might be true. As the weeks turned into months, Lila began to settle into her new life. She laughed, spoke, and even joined Nina in the kitchen to bake cookies one rainy afternoon. The nightmares, however, didn't vanish. They clung to her like shadows, haunting her in the stillness of the night. One freezing night, Lila woke with a start. The familiar dream of the dark road and her parents' retreating car had returned, leaving her breathless and trembling. She sat up in bed, hugging her knees to her chest as tears streamed down her face. A soft knock on the door startled her. "Lila." Nina's voice was gentle, filled with concern. "May I come in?" Lila wiped her tears quickly and whispered, "Yes." Nina entered, her robe wrapped tightly around her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes searching Lila's face. "Another nightmare?" she asked softly. Lila nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I keep dreaming about them," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "About when they left me." Nina reached out, taking Lila's hand in hers. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But you're not alone anymore, Lila. You're safe here. With us. The warmth of Nina's words broke something inside Lila. The tears she had tried to hide came rushing back, and before she could stop herself, she threw her arms around Nina, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline. Nina held her tightly, rocking her gently. "It's okay to be scared," she whispered. "It's okay to cry. But you don't have to face it alone." From that night on, Lila began to trust Nina and Vincent more deeply. She struggled with her fears, but no longer needed to hide them. When the nightmares came, she knew she could knock on their door and find comfort. When her memories threatened to overwhelm her, she found solace in their unwavering support. While helping Vincent plant flowers in the garden one afternoon, Lila asked, "Do you think I'll ever stop being scared?" Vincent paused, his hands covered in soil, and looked at her thoughtfully. "I think the fear might never completely go away," he said, "but I also think you'll get stronger. And the fear won't feel so big anymore when you do." Lila considered his words and nodded. For the first time, she began to believe that healing was possible, not easy or quick. Months turned into a year, and Lila's world began to feel steadier, though the cracks in her heart were far from mended. Nina and Vincent remained constant, their love as unwavering as the changing seasons. Lila started school again, a small local institution where teachers and students were patient with her quiet demeanor. At first, the classroom chaos made her retreat into herself, but gradually, she found her rhythm. One day, Nina handed her a journal with a soft lavender cover. "I thought you might like a place to put your thoughts," she said with a smile. "Sometimes writing things down can help." Lila took the journal carefully, running her fingers over its smooth surface. That evening, she opened it and stared at the blank page for a long time. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote, "Today." I smiled. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. As the days passed, Lila filled the pages with drawings, snippets of her thoughts, and even small poems. The journal became her refuge, where she could explore the emotions she still struggled to speak out loud. Nina and Vincent continued to nurture her growth. Nina often spent quiet afternoons baking cookies or painting in the garden with Lila. Vincent helped her with schoolwork in the evenings, his patience never wavering even when she grew frustrated. "Take your time, Lila," he would say gently. "It's not about being perfect. It's about trying." One Saturday, Vincent surprised her with an old bicycle he had found at a garage sale. He had spent hours fixing it, painting it a cheerful blue, and adding a small basket to the front. Lila's eyes lit up when she saw it. "For me?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Vincent smiled. "For you," he confirmed. "I thought we could practice riding it together." Though initially hesitant, she quickly rode. Her laughter rang as she wobbled down the quiet street. For the first time, she felt a sense of freedom, wind in her hair, the world stretching before her like an open canvas. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I think I'm learning what it feels like to be happy. It's a strange, beautiful thing." One afternoon, Lila came home from school to find Nina sitting on the porch, her face pale. Vincent stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Lila's stomach twisted with unease. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nina glanced at Vincent before kneeling in front of Lila. "Your parents, they reached out," she said gently. The words hit Lila like a thunderclap. Memories of the rainy road, the cold mud, and their retreating car flashed through her mind. Her hands clenched into fists. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "They saw a piece on the news about your school awards," Vincent explained carefully. "They claim they want to reconnect, but—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Lila looked between them, her chest heaving. She wanted to scream, to cry, to say no 1,000 times over. "I don't want to see them," she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. Nina reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to," she said softly. "We would never force you to do anything you're not ready for." Lila nodded, her throat tight. "They left me," she whispered. "They abandoned me. Why now? Why do they care now?" Vincent's expression softened, and he knelt beside Nina. People like that, they don't change easily, he said. But their actions don't define you, Lila. You're so much more than the way they treated you. The next few days were tense, but Nina and Vincent were a fortress around Lila, shielding her from further contact. When the emotions became too much to bear, Lila turned to her journal, pouring her anger and confusion onto the pages. While sitting on her bed one night, Nina handed her a mug of hot cocoa. "You're brave, Lila," she said, sitting beside her. "Facing your past isn't easy, but you're not alone. Vincent and we're here for you. Always." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but they weren't just tears of pain this time. They were tears of gratitude. She leaned into Nina, letting herself feel the warmth of a love that asked for nothing in return. That night, for the first time in weeks, Lila slept peacefully. The years that followed were transformative for Lila. With Nina and Vincent's unwavering support, she began to thrive. She excelled in school, and her quiet determination earned the admiration of her teachers. Each report card brought a new wave of pride from her adoptive parents, who celebrated even her most minor victories as though they were monumental. Lila's journal became her constant companion. Over time, its pages shifted from raw outpourings of pain to reflections on hope, gratitude, and dreams for the future. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Nina, she shared a passage she had written. "Family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who shows up, stays, and loves you when you feel unlovable." Nina's eyes filled with tears, and she reached over to squeeze Lila's hand. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said softly, "and so true." By the time Lila reached high school, she had become a top student. Her hard work earned her a scholarship to an elite summer program in science, a subject she had grown to love. Vincent spent late nights helping her with applications, his patience endless as he proofread essays and brainstormed ideas with her. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Lila said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to," Vincent replied with a smile. "We're in this together." The three celebrated with homemade pizza and laughter that warmed the house when her acceptance letter arrived. Lila couldn't stop smiling, her heart packed in a way she had never thought possible. Lila's past came back into focus once more on the day she received her high school diploma. She stood on the stage, dressed in her cap and gown, scanning the crowd for Nina and Vincent. When she spotted them, Nina waving enthusiastically and Vincent snapping photos, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. But then, as she descended the stage, she saw them. Her biological parents, Rachel and Martin, standing at the back of the crowd. They looked older, worn down by time, their faces etched with regret. For a moment, Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. After the ceremony, Nina and Vincent stayed close, sensing her unease. "Do you want us to leave you alone with them?" Vincent asked gently. "No," Lila said firmly, her voice steady. "I want you both there." Rachel and Martin approached cautiously, their movements hesitant. "Lila," Rachel began, her voice trembling. "You've grown so much. We saw you graduate and wanted to say how proud we are." Lila's heart ached with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long yearning for their approval as a child, but now, their words felt hollow, arriving too late to matter. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone calm but direct. Martin shuffled uncomfortably. "We've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "We're trying to make amends." Lila looked at Nina and Vincent, their presence a steadying force beside her. She turned back to Rachel and Martin, her expression unreadable. "I've spent years rebuilding myself after what you did," she said. "I'm not the broken little girl you left behind anymore." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "We're sorry," she whispered. Lila took a deep breath, the weight of her past pressing against her chest. "I don't hate you," she said finally, "but I've already found my family. Nina and Vincent are the parents I needed, and I'm grateful for them every day." Her words were resolute but not cruel. She didn't feel the need to punish them. She had outgrown that pain. "I hope you find peace," she said softly. "But I've moved on." Rachel and Martin nodded, their faces etched with sorrow. They didn't argue or beg. Instead, they turned and walked away, leaving Lila with the family that had chosen her. not out of obligation, but out of love. That evening, Lila sat with Nina and Vincent around the dinner table, the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the window. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice full of emotion, "for everything. For being there when I needed you most." Nina reached across the table to take her hand, her eyes shining. "You don't have to thank us, Lila. You're our daughter. We love you." Vincent nodded, his voice steady. "And we always will." Years later, as Lila graduated college with honors and began a career as an advocate for children in foster care, she often thought about the path that had brought her here. Her work wasn't just about giving back, but honoring the love that had saved her. One evening, as she flipped through her old journals, she came across a passage from years ago. "I don't know if I'll ever feel whole again, but I hope I can help others feel less broken." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't the little girl standing in the rain anymore. She had a purpose, a family, and a hope-filled life.